Good afternoon. I'm going to talk to you about how to run experiments, but I'm going to do it in a way in which you understand why it's important to run experiments. I was working with a big insurance company in Southeast Asia, and we were trying to disrupt the remittance market. What do I mean by remittance? People sending money home. Who are these people that are sending money home? In the Philippines in particular, they are maids. These maids are usually working in Singapore, they're usually working in Hong Kong, or in the UAE, and they're making $500 to $800 a month, and they only have 14 holidays every 2 years. And what's very interesting about their story is that the remittance services, such as Western Union or MoneyGram, they're taking 20% of the money they are shipping back to the Philippines. And what's really interesting about them is that the money that they're sending home account for 25% of the GDP of the Philippines. So it's a huge pool of money going into the Philippines every single month, out of which Western Union and MoneyGram are taking 20% without doing much. So we said that we want to build a faster and cheaper way for people to remit money home. And in order to achieve that, we had a couple of assumptions. First of all, we were really interested to understand if OFWs, meaning overseas Filipino workers, are interested in sending money home cheaply, or they are happy with the fee or the commissions that services like Western Union were taking. Also, we were really interested to see if they want to go to the Western Union office, or they want to send it over a mobile app or a website. And also, we were really interested to see how do they remit money? And when do they do that? Do they remit on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis? Do they save money and then they send that entire shipment of cash home? Or how does that work? In order to do that, we went and we actually spoke with overseas Filipino workers. We spoke with them at the office where they get the visa in order to leave the Philippines and work abroad. But we also spoke with them in locations such as Singapore and Hong Kong. What we've learned is that the fees are not the issue. The fees were not the primary concern of the OFWs. The OFWs only have access to their phones on the weekends. This was their primary concern. Their primary concern was that they didn't know what was going on with the money that they were sending. The primary reason to go abroad to begin with was to pay bills and send their kids to better schools. And they were going and working 10 years, 15 years, with only 14 holidays every 2 years, and then sending money home to their partner, to their spouse, or to whoever's left with the children. And they said that the fees were not the biggest issue, so we totally scrapped the initial idea. We moved on to the next idea, and we said we're going to build a digital wallet, a e-wallet where people can put money and then send that money home in a cheaper way, faster way, and probably even direct to a spouse or direct to a school or direct to an energy company. So the first thing we did was try to build a prototype, a paper prototype, and then we were trying to see if people were loading money on the topping up with money, that particular account, if they were able to find that button, and how were they willing to do it? Were they willing to do it by going to a 7-Eleven? Were they willing to do it with a credit card? How were they willing to actually top up? What we've actually learned in that prototype was that nobody found the top-up button. And what was very interesting about it is that the button was very visible. We asked them, do you see the button? Everybody was confirming that they saw the button. The problem is that the English that we speak is different than the English they speak. For them to top up means load. So there was no way for them to find the top up button because they didn't understand the word top up. And we asked them, so what do you do when you actually deposit money? Oh, I load money. It was very interesting. And then we changed our entire prototype to just say load money. When we changed from top up to load money, everybody started converting. So we were onto something. But so far, we failed in so many ways that you couldn't even imagine. So the interviews failed, the first experiments failed, and every single assumption that we had was pretty much not holding water. This reminded me of a quote from General Patton that no plant survives first enemy contact. This was exactly what we were facing every day in our own trench. Every single plan that we had in order to tackle the problem was just totally scrapped by an experiment with the customer. But we said, okay, I think we're onto something. We understand how these people work, what's their psychic, what makes them tick. And we said we're going to make a pivot. We're going to make a pivot to a website. It was mobile responsive, so it was far from our initial idea of an app. And we said that how about people splitting the money at source instead of splitting the money at home? What we realized in the interviews is that whenever people were sending money home, they were entrusting that the spouse or the partner left at home or their parents would take care of all the bills, will take care of building the house that they always wanted. They were trusting that the bills for the kids' education were going to be paid. But in many cases, what we learned from interviews is that the spouse that was left at home in the Philippines was getting all this cash every week or every month, and they were most of the time taking to the bottle, they were using drugs, or they were spending the money on stuff that they actually didn't need, such as big-ass plasma TVs and new motorbikes and all of that stuff. Why? Because the money was cheap. They didn't have to work for it. And what was really interesting is that every single time they were talking with the loved one that's working abroad, they were confirming that, yeah, you know, I've paid for the kids' education, I've paid for the bills, I am building the house. With only 14 days of holiday every 2 years, there was no way for the person that left the country to check on the progress of the house, on the kids' education. And they were many times coming back to the Philippines, realizing that, yes, there was no house that was being built, and the kids' school was not paid, and they had to go to a state-owned school. Or some bills were not paid, and then they got disconnected from internet or from gas or from water. So it was a big problem for them to entrust the partner that was left home. And we said, well, how about we are able to split the money at source? So splitting the money at the point where the money is actually being made in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in UAE. So for that person to actually redirect money to certain accounts instead of sending one lump sum to everybody at home, and they will split it by themselves. So we created a simple website, and we wanted to actually experiment what are they sending money home for, and what is their primary motivation to do that. Because obviously the interviews told us kids' education, but then we learned that kids' education was probably second to paying bills. And these are some screenshots from the actual website. The first step they needed to do was they needed to create an account. They needed to sign up. And by signing up, they were giving us their first name, their family name, and also their email. Again, this is a prototype. We had only one simple database behind it. I'm going to tell you the beauty of the simple website that we created. The next step was for them to select what do they want to send money home for. What was the reason for them to send money? And as you can see in the list, they had many options. All of the options that are in the list were things that we learned from the interviews. There were the things that they told us in the interviews. One of them was actually paying bills. The other one was saving for a house. Again, remember, there's nothing behind this website. It was just a pure HTML and a database that was just recording their email addresses. That was all the functionality that they had. Then the next thing they needed to do, they needed to actually name the pocket. They needed to give a name to that particular wallet. They said, I want to create a wallet to pay bills. Perfect. What do you want to name it? Oh, I want to name it Pay Bills or Bills. Because then they can create another one, which will allow them to save for kids' education. And they will see two wallets in their dashboard. The next thing was they needed to tell us what do they want to spend the money for. Let's say if it's a bill, was it a water? Was it electricity bill? Was it a gas? Was it internet? What's their customer number? And what's the invoice number? And then they had to tell us how much they needed to pay. Then the next one was to actually give us money. That was the next step in the prototype. What was very interesting here is that we connected everything to PayPal. So the overseas Filipino worker that went through this website was faced now, after this step, with a PayPal page. And we were actually charging them for that particular invoice. The beauty about it is that the system was not connected to anything other than my personal PayPal. So what we were actually doing, we were taking money from these people's pockets, putting it into my personal PayPal, and then the following thing I was doing, I was calling our office in Manila, where our colleagues were sitting, and say, hey, I have a bill for you to pay. This is the bill number. This is the customer number. You have to go now to the electricity provider or the internet provider or the gas provider and pay that amount. I'm going to pay it back to you because I already have the money in my PayPal account. And we did it for, I think, 10 or 12 customers. We limited the experiment because it said, okay, it's very shady to get money from various Filipinos in your PayPal account. What was very, very interesting is what happened 1 month later. So we went and we paid the bills, and we waited for 1 month. We waited for 1 month, 30 days, do nothing. In 30 days, out of the 12 that initially signed up with us and sent me personally money, 11 came back. 11 came back, and they repeated the process, but this time, some of them actually brought 2 invoices. So it was like, oh, okay, so you paid my gas one? Here you go, I have the water one. We redid the entire process. I was getting money in my PayPal account, and my colleagues were taking money and then going and paying by themselves at the 7-Eleven or at the gas or an electricity provider that particular invoice. And then at one point, I said, well, this is not sustainable for us. We can't build a business around me taking money in my PayPal account and giving money to my colleagues and them paying invoices. Because first of all, it was very shady on my PayPal account. Second of all, it was very expensive. And third of all, I think it was not really ethical. But I doubted the last one. So what we were actually doing, here we were learning a lot. But we said we needed to stop, because we had enough evidence that people want to use the service, people have a need for this kind of service, and there is obviously retention in the service. So we stopped the website, we stopped the experiment, and we emailed all 12 of the people that were in the initial phase. All 12 of them replied back saying, what do you mean it was an experiment? Because my bills were paid. Yeah, it was an experiment. We actually had to send people to pay them physically. Oh, okay. So how about I pay you more and you continue doing this for me? Every single one said that. And of course, we started digging deeper into that. How much more are you willing to pay me? Because we were really interested to understand, is it 3% too much, 5%, 50%, 20%? And apparently they said that 5% will be what they wanted. We actually had one lady saying that she's willing to pay us as much as we want to cover for the fees, because she was coming from a tiny island in the Philippines. And the problem was that none of the energy suppliers, gas suppliers, water suppliers had an office on her island. So the parents, being 70, they needed to take a boat to the big island and pay that particular invoices once a month and then take the boat back. And she was very worried about the health of her parents and their well-being, because it's very difficult when you're old to travel in the heat of a tropical sea and of a tropical jungle to go and pay invoices. And she said, I'm willing. She was actually working for Ford in Bangkok. And she said, I'm willing to pay you whatever it takes, as long as you're safeguarding the health and the well-being of my parents by not having me send them every month to the office to pay those invoices. And that's when we realized that we were actually onto something. This product would definitely work. And then we continued to do another experiment on kids' education, which was very much similar to the first one. We were taking money, and then we were paying stuff back from our own pockets to various schools initially was in the Manila area. And the results were exactly the same. We had a lot of retention, but again, it was not sustainable because we were losing money on every transaction. In total, I can tell you that in over 8 months, we've done 40 experiments, and we had about 30 major learnings, 30 major epiphanies. And these particular epiphanies, they helped us create a new product for the company that hired us to create a new remittance service. So we started from the idea we want to disrupt the remittance market, and we ended up building a product that was actually helping people have a more fulfilling life and basically safeguarding their loved one's home by splitting the money at source. This is the journey that we've been on for 8 months. So what we've learned in that, and these are basically the takeaways on how to run experiments in your own company. First of all, you need to figure out what's going to kill you first. So you need to figure out what's the most critical assumption in your business. Every single business model has one critical assumption. In our case, towards our last experiments, our critical assumption was that people want to use our service more than once. Not just pay one bill, but be a returning customer, so to have retention there. The way to figure out what's going to kill you first, I encourage you to do a simple exercise. Just go with your team and write down on Post-it notes all the assumptions that you have about your business. People want to have X, or we believe that the customer is Y, or we believe that a certain thing needs to happen in order for us to be successful. After you're done with writing all the assumptions, draw a line on a whiteboard, a horizontal line, and name it unknown and known. And then place your assumptions on that line from known to unknown, depending on how much knowledge you have behind that particular assumption. Do you actually know a lot about that or not that much? If you're not certain, if you're not sure how much you know about a particular assumption, place it in the unknown part of the scale. Then the last step, draw another line straight in the middle, a vertical line, call it impact line, high impact, low impact. And now take every single assumption and just move it up and down. No longer left and right, but up and down, depending on how much impact that particular assumption is going to have on your business model. What do I mean by high impact? The high impact assumptions, these are the assumptions that are going to put you out of business if they are proven wrong or disproven. In our case was people coming back to pay the same invoice or another invoice was our most critical assumption. We had no clue what if they are willing to come back after they've done it once. And second of all, we know that if they were not willing to come back, we were totally out of business. So that was our most critical assumption. Then run experiments. And Sean Ellis talked about running experiments this morning. And it's very important to be very good and very disciplined at running experiments. An experiment usually follows these steps that you see behind me. First of all, you need to define what's the assumption that you want to test. Don't just run an experiment for the sake of running an experiment. Be very clear of what you want to learn. Do you remember that scene? It was in, I think it was Alice in Wonderland. It was Alice in Wonderland. She just got to Wonderland, and she walks up to the crossroad. It was a big crossroad, and in the crossroad there was a tree. In a tree there was a cat. Do you remember that conversation between Alice and the cat? And Alice is obviously puzzled by being in Wonderland. She's trying to get home. And she's asking the cat, which road should I take? And the cat replies, well, it depends on where you want to go. And Alice says, well, I don't know where I want to go. And then the cat says something very smart. Then any road will take you there. So unless you know what you want to learn, it's no point in running any experiments. So start an experiment with the thing you want to learn. Start your experiment from the critical assumption. Then define the cohort and be very specific. Who are these people you want to test the assumption for? Because selecting the right cohort is going to have an impact on the result of the experiment. If you're picking people at random, you're going to have random results. If you're being very specific on who you're going to pick, then you are going to actually be able to learn and identify causal relationships between your actions and your value proposition, for example, and the way people reacted to that. So it's very important how to select that. And in Facebook or in Google Ads, there's so many ways in which you can segment your market. But again, be very specific. Don't just say everybody. Don't just assume everybody that's working in Bangkok that comes from the Philippines. No, be very specific. Maids or engineers, aeronautic engineers in UAE. Be very specific on who are you targeting with your experiment. Then the last one is actually define what that experiment is. It can be simple interviews. It can be a paper prototype. It can be the complex thing I've just did, which is actually called the Wizard of Oz experiment. You can do a lot of experiments, but be very clear what the experiment is and decide with your team what kind of appetite do you have to push the boundaries of what's possible. And the last one, is create a clear fail condition and a time box for your experiment. What do I mean by fail condition? Give a numerical value for your experiment or for your assumption to be called out as a failure. Say if our conversion rate is below 3% on this experiment, we're going to call the assumption invalid. If our experiment, however, converts more than 3%, then we are going to call the assumption valid and we're going to move on. But this is very important. And there's 3 ways to define your fail condition. You can define your fail condition by looking at industry averages. If you are a software company, software as a service, let's say, there's so many numbers out there you can use on conversion rates. There's so much information out there you can use in order to build a strong experiment. So that's number 1. Number 2 is to start from your business model. What do we need to have in order for our business model to be sustainable and we as a company to be profitable? What do we need to convert in order for this business model to make sense? If that particular thing is not going to happen, you know that later on you're going to have bigger issues and you're not going to be profitable. And the third one, look at your competitors. Look at what your competitors are converting. Look at various KPIs of your competitors and use that as your fail condition. If you're not able to change that particular KPI in a meaningful way to be better than your competitor, ask yourself how worse than your competitor are. Are you 100% worse than your competitor or just 2% worse than your competitor? So these are some ways to create your fail conditions. Then it's very important to time box every experiment, because otherwise you're going to fall in the trap of saying that maybe next week the things are going to change, or maybe the week after that things are going to improve. So just be very clear. We're going to run this experiment for exactly 10 days starting tomorrow. If in 10 days nothing happens, we're going to call out the assumption as invalid. The last thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you're allowing your experiments to fail. I've coached many startups, and I've seen many startups struggling with this. Struggling with this in the sense of they don't have an assumption, they have a cause. They have a cause. I need to make this work. No, you don't need to make this work. You can make all the others' idea work, but we're going to learn which one is going to work, and we're going to learn by doing experiments. So please design your experiments in a way in which they fail. In science, they are called falsifiable experiments or falsifiable assumptions. So create experiments that can actually fail. I can give you a short example here. I was running another experiment with a product team, and then the designer came to me. We're trying to see if people want to click on a certain feature in the app. And we did it in a very lean startup way. We just created the button. There was absolutely no feature behind it. We were just tracking how many people click on the button. And then the designer in the team came to me and said, "Dan, I have a great idea." Shoot. Well, I think we should put a big red bubble on top of it saying new. Well, I said, well, Roof, that's a very great idea, but I'm not going to allow it. Why? Because the only thing I would learn is if people are attracted to the new bubble. I'm not learning if the people want the feature. I'm just learning if people click on new. So then my experiment, there was no way for that experiment to fail. It was not a falsifiable experiment. So it's very important to create falsifiable experiments. And another thing that I've learned is that a lot of startup teams fail in taking decisions after their experiments. They are afraid to actually take a decision. They ran an experiment, they analyze the data, they get the insight, and then they go back to business as usual. Well, what's the point of running the experiment to begin with? Just stop running the experiments and just do whatever you want, if you're not willing to take a decision following your experiment. So it's very important to take decisions. And then decisions, again, can be 3 types. You can take a decision to call the assumption valid, invalid. You can take a decision of the experiment being inconclusive. So that means you're going to run it again. Or you're going to take the decision to move on to the next assumption. It's very simple, but take a decision. Be disciplined, and after every single experiment, take a decision. Then it's very important to be creative. The experiment that I just explained to you when we were taking PayPal money from Filipinos and then calling our friends to pay bills, those were experiments that it took us a couple of days to think about, and it required a lot of creativity. So try to create a culture of creativity and try to create a culture of inclusiveness in your team and accept everybody's idea as being valid. And try to figure out ways in which you can run experiments without actually being a burden on the tech team. Try to do it cheap, try to do it dirty, but Most importantly, try to do it fast. My name is Toma. I wrote this book called The Corporate Startup. It's translated in, I think, 4 or 5 languages. It talks about innovation in large organizations. There's a lot of the stories I just described to you in this book, and it's actually encompassing more than just experiments. And I want to leave you with one simple quote from Churchill, saying that success is going from failure to failure without the loss of enthusiasm. So if you're failing, don't worry, there is a pot of gold waiting on you. It's just probably 1 or 2 failures away. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you as well. I have a personal curiosity. What is the experiment you're most excited about right now?
The one I'm doing right now, I'm working with a maritime company in Norway, and we're performing an experiment where we're trying to learn if particular ship owners are willing to subscribe to a service, and we don't have the service there. So it's imagine like a software as a service landing page, where you have the value proposition, you click, you go and see the plans, and then you choose the right plan, and then after the plan, it's a simple contact form. So this is actually what we're running. I think we're going to start next week, and we're going to see in 1 week if people want to buy it.
That fits with the be naughty category,
Totally,
right?
totally. Try to be devilish.
Okay, we have another, a bit more serious question now. How do you define the right cohort when it comes to testing? How do you pick its characteristics?
Very good question. Obviously, start looking at your target market. Try to see who is the person that needs to actually be using that particular service. If you've identified that person as being, let's say, stay-at-home moms with 2 kids, then that becomes your cohort. And the beauty about running it in today's modern age where we have so many tools is that you can actually see how big your cohort is by looking at Google ads and Facebook ads. If you create the right filters, it's going to show you how big your market is. But obviously start from your business model. Look on the right-hand side of your business model. The customer segment you've put there, that's the person you need to run an experiment on. Great
advice. Thank you very much. For all of you here, Dan will be joining us on the Q&A stage for a more extended Q&A session at 3:30. And the Q&A stage is when you go out into the next building and to the right. You'll definitely find it. Dan will be there at 3:30, and you'll have opportunities to address more questions with him. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.